but we are absolutely designed to be attractive peers and to do everything possible to become attractive peers. Testosterone, as one example, is not only there to make our voices lower and grow hair on our bodies and big muscles, which is important for survival as you become an adult. It's also there to clue us into the social zeitgeist. It's all about what's my role in this hierarchy. And once kids hit puberty, they care immensely, more than they have before and more than they ever will again, about how others perceive them. Mm-hmm. And it's because of testosterone that we start to gauge ourselves against others. And it's not always competition and fighting in terms of fighting or out racing someone or being a better football player. In various settings, depending on what the culture is, that will determine how people compete. So, in monasteries, Tibetan monks in training, adolescent boys compete to be more kind and compassionate than other Tibetan Buddhist monks. So one of the lessons here for parents is that you really want to think about what social groups your kid is in, and you want to help to guide that as much as you can, because if they're on the swim team and the goal is to be the fastest swimmer, that's like a really great goal to have, or to be one of the better swimmers. Huh. But if they're not getting fulfillment from swimming or academics or playing in a rock band or whatever else it is, they'll find themselves at the bottom of this pecking order, and other brain changes will absolutely take effect that will make it more likely that they hang out with kids who aren't engaged in such exciting things and are not doing well in school and using drugs and that kind of thing.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
You're ready to get back into yoga, so you ordered the essentials: a non-slip mat, yoga blocks to keep balance, and an exercise ball. And you used your Bank of America Cash Rewards credit card, choosing to earn 3% cash back on online shopping, or up to 5.25% as a preferred rewards member, which you put towards the cost of your most essential yoga gear: noise-canceling headphones. Apply for yours at bankofamerica.com/more rewarding. Copyright 2020 Bank of America Corporation.
Going to the liquor store is great, but what if all your local liquor stores came to you? Well, spoiler alert, they can with Drizzly, the #1 app for alcohol delivery. Compare prices from stores near you on a huge selection of beer, wine, and spirits, and then get them delivered right to your door in under 60 minutes. And right now, Drizzly is giving all new customers $5 off their first order. Just enter promo code SAVE at checkout. Download the Drizzly app or go to DRIZLY.com.
So let's talk about mobile plans for a minute, because honestly, we can't live without them. And there's nothing as annoying as yelling, "Can you hear me?" to someone on the other end of the phone, or refreshing your phone to listen to the latest episode of The Unmistakable Creative, only to discover that it isn't there. If you're anything like me, you want the best coverage and fastest data speeds without spending a fortune or without getting locked into a contract or promising your firstborn just to get a new phone. Reach Mobile offers the best mobile network at a fair price, plus amazing customer service, convenience, and no contract. So switching providers is usually a pain, but switching to Reach is simple. You just order your welcome kit and activate in minutes from home. You can even bring your own unlocked phone and keep your number. And their 24/7 customer support team is friendly, helpful, and uses common sense. They actually pick up the phone when you call them. It's no wonder they have 4.8 out of 5 stars on Trustpilot. When it comes to lowering your cell phone bill, Reach Mobile's Best Fit feature is a game changer. Don't stress about which plan to choose. If you use less data one month, they'll discount your bill automatically to the plan you actually used. That's money going back into your pocket, not theirs, and customers can save an extra $300 per year. Reach Mobile brings you the best mobile network with no contract, no sketchy policies, and no fine print. So if you're ready for better mobile service, head to reachmobile.com and use the code CREATIVE to save $45 during your first 3 months. Jess, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me on. I'm thrilled to be with you.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So I was introduced to you by way of our mutual friend, Megan Poe, who's probably my favorite guest of the whole year. I had a fascinating conversation with her. So when she recommended you, I figured, okay, this is a no-brainer. Anybody who she sends our way, I have to talk to. So I want to start by asking you, what social group were you a part of in high school, and how did that end up influencing the choices that you've made with your life and your career?
That's a great question. That's a really nice question. I was a bit of I wouldn't say loner in high school, but I straddled many groups, and I often felt that I was sort of doing my own thing. So I came into high school like everybody else in a suburb of San Francisco, moved from the same elementary school to the same middle school to the same high school. Each year, more kids were added, or each jump to middle school and high school, more kids were added. But by the time I hit high school, I was trying to be like everybody else, and I joined the football team, and I played football. I joined a rock band. I was playing guitar by then for about a year, and I was getting kind of good. And so I joined a rock and roll band in the evenings. And that was sort of trying to find my identity there, or my peer group. And so I was always a friendly kid, so I fit in with lots of different groups. But by the time I was, part of my story is, of course, then that I was doing terribly in school. So I'm playing on a football team. I'm playing in the rock band, and I'm just failing English and getting maybe C's in other classes. And my dad just goes berserk. Now, I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and both of my brothers didn't go to college. My sisters both went to college, saying they're going to be a doctor like my father. And within a semester or two, they decided to go into fields like forestry and nursing. And so my parents, I think, were very invested in me not having that kind of college experience and making it through college. And so when they saw a D in freshman English or an F, whatever it was, they hit the roof. And they did something that at the time made me very angry, but in retrospect was really outstanding parenting, which they hadn't done with my brothers, unfortunately. And what they did was first to say, okay, you're quitting the football team. And quitting the football team 2 weeks before the end of the season, when you're already on the third string of this, probably 4 strings of football team. Mm-hmm. Every freshman boy is sort of dying to have a role in this. And I was fine, but I was not terribly big or especially fast. And I was a good friend to lots of people, and sort of having to go to the coach and saying I have to leave the team was remarkably humiliating. But I remember being very straight-faced about it. And then the coach the next day tells the team that I had to leave. I mean, there were like 40 boys on the team. I don't know if anybody would have noticed, but he says, Jess had to leave the team. And it's not like he was crying or anything, but he was really disappointed to have to leave the team. And so all my friends come up to me saying, hey, I heard you were crying when you quit the team. So, a lot of lack of sensitivity on all sorts of angles. My dad, I think, really should have probably let me finish out the season. But anyway, I had to quit the rock band. And then my mom or dad were home after school every day for the next couple of months. And if they couldn't be home, they would call me and check on me regularly. And of course, we didn't have cell phones, so they knew if I was home, I was answering the phone. And I answered the phone, and they would say, get your homework done, get your homework done. And I started studying 3 and 4 hours a day to catch up because I was very behind. I fought like crazy for months, and I think I pulled my grade point to about a B by the end of my first semester. But the second semester, I went back to school. The fights settled down a little bit. My parents stayed on my back, but in a supportive way. And I started getting into school, and I started actually enjoying school. A lot of this goes along with the book I just wrote called Born to be Wild, which is really about adolescent development. And in this process around, the high school years, your dopamine neurons, which are a signal of reward or potential for reward, and lead us. Dopamine is really a learning neurochemical. It leads us to what it is that we should be doing that's good for our survival. And as we age and we become more intellectually engaged, dopamine synapses start to make it to our frontal cortex, which makes intellectual material more interesting. And this is why the newspaper is more interesting to a 15-year-old than it is to a 10-year-old. Mm-hmm. Or why certain movies or topics, you want to read something. You're much more interested in the Great Gatsby when you're 16 than you are when you're 12, because these stories of people in their lives start to make more sense to you. So I started to get into school, and I think I hit it at the right time. My dopamine was hitting my frontal cortex, and by spring I got straight A's. My parents were off my back, and I was getting now a lot of self-efficacy and support and engagement from my academic work. So back to your original question, which is what peer group was I in? So I started out in kind of a tough peer group. The kids that I'd known from middle school and elementary school who were my closest friends, many of whom partied all weekend, would drink 3 6-packs of beer on a Friday night and a Saturday night. And I was doing that too, would get high after school. And I was doing that too. And then, as I started to get more involved in school, I started to meet a whole other group of kids who were really strong academically. But to me, they were mostly nerds, or they were, all on the swim team or something. And that wasn't my thing. So I kind of straddled these smart kids during the day at school. And in the afternoons and evenings, I hung out with my buddies who played football in the park and baseball and would sit around a keg and drink on the weekend. Mm-hmm. But I found myself wanting to drink and smoke and do those things less and less because I was really getting my satisfaction out of school. So I still played music, but I played in sort of more jam session-y kind of things. And I stopped playing organized sports, but I started taking bike rides or jogging after school so I could stay in shape, typically for an hour, pretty much most afternoons. And then I'd come and do 3 or 4 hours of homework. And, I had some very, very close friends. I would say 2 of whom, at least, I'm really still close with now, and a number of whom I'm close with when I have the opportunity. But I did feel like I straddled things. When I remember one day, maybe junior or senior year, when school was canceled, there was like a gas leak at the school. So it was like 10 in the morning and everybody was left out, let to go. And the smart kids all went off to do their little smarty thing. And the partier kids all sort of went off to do their party thing. And I was sort of like, who do I go with? Where do I go? Who do I belong with? Now, I think that's partly a universal experience in high school. You're not sure who you belong with and how. But I think that answers your question. I was sort of in between, and I felt that. I felt like a kid who worked really hard, but whose sensibilities were more with the regular kids, not necessarily the studiers. But I had a lot intellectually in common with the studiers and got a lot of fulfillment out of that.
Interesting. A couple of questions come from that. One, as you were saying that, the thought that crossed my mind is we spend, all of our adolescence trying to fit in, and then by the time we get to adulthood, we're spending all of our time trying to stand out. At least, I feel that in the world that, we live in today, because, when you're in the working world, what are you trying to do? You're trying to stand out as, an outstanding performer. Or if you're a creative person who's doing work on the internet, you want your work to stand out in some way. Why is that? Why is it that we go from desperately wanting to fit in to desperately trying to stand out?
So that's also a good question. And I think that these things, I think they're actually all going on at the same time. I think there is some weighting of it. Yeah. I saw a comic years ago about a little boy complaining to his mother, and he said to her something like, I just want to be different like everybody else. At 13 or 14, I just want to be different like everybody else. The idea that, we all need to be sort of our own person, yet we care so much about what others think. Now, when we're 13 or 14 or 15 or 19 or 22, we care a great deal about what others think of us. And I believe this is built into our genetic code. I think this is what evolution has done to us, because these are your peak reproductive years from about 15 to 30. And so it's really, really important that we get others to think that we are good so that we will be a good and select mate. So there's no question in my mind that, and I can go through the brain systems if you want to talk about hormones and what their role is, but we are absolutely designed to be attractive peers and to do everything possible to become attractive peers. Testosterone, as one example, is not only there to make our voices lower and grow hair on our bodies and big muscles, which is important for survival as you become an adult. It's also there to clue us into the social zeitgeist. It's all about what's my role in this hierarchy. And once kids hit puberty, they care immensely, more than they have before and more than they ever will again, about how others perceive them. Mm-hmm. And it's because of testosterone that we start to gauge ourselves against others. And it's not always competition and fighting in terms of fighting or out racing someone or being a better football player. In various settings, depending on what the culture is, that will determine how people compete. So, in monasteries, Tibetan monks in training, adolescent boys compete to be more kind and compassionate than other Tibetan Buddhist monks. So one of the lessons here for parents is that you really want to think about what social groups your kid is in, and you want to help to guide that as much as you can, because if they're on the swim team and the goal is to be the fastest swimmer, that's like a really great goal to have, or to be one of the better swimmers. But if they're not getting fulfillment from swimming or academics or playing in a rock band or whatever else it is, they'll find themselves at the bottom of this pecking order, and other brain changes will absolutely take effect that will make it more likely that they hang out with kids who aren't engaged in such exciting things and are not doing well in school and using drugs and that kind of thing. Other hormones, oxytocin, which many people know about as being important for milk letdown and helping to halt ovulation after a baby's born so a mother can pay attention to this first baby. Oxytocin also clues us into who's in the peer group, who is in and who is out, and is in part responsible for adolescent cliques. Estrogen. We know that when a woman is ovulating, around the 48 hours that she ovulates, that's her most fertile time of the month. And Estrogen does other things too. It makes a woman's face a little bit more symmetrical. Women who are in the throes of ovulation find male-enhanced testosterone features like a chiseled face and stubble in the beard and a low voice. They'll report when they look at pictures and studies and things that they find these things more attractive when they're ovulating. Women tend to dress a little more provocatively. The blouse gets a little bit more unbuttoned when they're ovulating. And this is all to prepare for sexual engagement so they have the best chance of getting pregnant. And men who are in the presence of women who are ovulating release more testosterone. And they sit closer to these women and they touch them more and they flirt with them more. And all of this is really in our code. We're mostly unaware of this sort of thing. Most women don't even know when they ovulate, and most men don't know why all of a sudden the woman they work with is kind of more attractive this time at this moment. It's like, well, it's like she smells really good today. Have you noticed that? There's this kind of sense that we're being led around to some degree, of course, by our DNA. And these hormones don't make us do these things, but they give us the opportunity and they prompt us or prime us to do these things. So I think that the hormones are very important, and they clue young people into what their peers are thinking. So the first part of your question is, why do we care so much about what others think of us when we're high school students or young adults? The answer is we are led to do it by hormones because it's to our evolutionary advantage to mate at this point when we're our most fertile, our most strong, and we have the best chance of passing on our DNA. So we really better care what other people think, because if we don't care what they think, we're not going to get a good mate.
Wow.
The second part of that is, what happens with age. And I would suggest that many of us still care a great deal about what others think of them. And they still, of course, do, believe that matters. Somebody said to me just recently the rule of 13, 40, 60, which gets to your point. At 13, you just completely care about what other people are thinking of you, and you can't think of anything else. At 40, you realize that you don't care what they think about you anymore, and it doesn't even matter what they think. And at 60, you realize no one ever thought of you at all anyway. They were all too busy thinking about themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
I tell this to college students who I teach, not exactly in those terms, but I say as you age, I kind of leave out the 40, but I say as you get older, what you realize is that most people are just sort of so nervous about their own situation. They're not even paying attention to you in terms of, the nervousness or the things that you're worried about, which to them would be ridiculous if they heard you talk about those things.
It's funny. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's funny you say that. I was talking to my friend about dating, and he said, you realize, every time you go on a date and you're worried about what this girl is thinking about you, she's thinking of the exact same thing as you are. She's Absolutely. Worried about what you think about her.
Totally. And so, we put on all these defenses and we sort of act like, oh, I don't care, devil may care, I'm so comfortable and relaxed. But it's all an act. Those who can contain their anxiety well or channel it into humor or, optimism or gratitude or, some sort of altruism, those people tend to do very, very well. But those who don't hide it well and can't put on a defense and feel like, oh, that's false, they have more trouble. And they have more trouble connecting to people socially. So with age, to your other half, I think I would say at 40 or 50 or middle age, people still care about what others think, and sometimes desperately, because they're really building their careers now. So they care for sort of a different reason. Mm-hmm. It's not so much mating. It's more about being successful and supporting your family and making sure everybody's going to be financially okay and your ego fulfillment and all of that. But it definitely does decrease over time. And you get to the point where, at some point there's things are much more balanced, in other words, with time. But I think that the real difference is what happens when you're young and the need to be an attractive mate. Mm-hmm.
So, one of the other things that's really interesting to me about the beginning of this story is sort of the dramatic shift in habits and, personality almost. Are there, can you get to a point in adult life where it's not possible to make these kinds of shifts? Are things set in stone? Because I know we've done a lot of research that people like you have done has shown neuroplasticity is possible. Like, I can tell you I'm a very different person than I was even in college and at the beginning of my career. Like, the level of discipline and focus I have is night and day difference from years of doing creative work. And I'm just curious, do we reach a point at which it's harder to make, those kinds of changes? And, what do you say to parents who see kids that are, headed down a wrong path?
Yeah, so the first part of that question is there's no doubt that the first 12 years of our lives, our brain is more plastic, more flexible than it will ever be again. At this point, our gray matter or the nerve cells themselves are growing very rapidly. So if you haven't learned a second language by the time you're 12, if you haven't learned to ride a bicycle, if you haven't learned to throw a baseball or play piano, these things are going to be much more difficult 10 years later or even 5 years later. Because what happens at this point is your brain says, okay, now we're heading towards puberty. Now we're heading towards reproduction. So now we know what we do well. Now we know that this person is not going to be a baseball player or a piano player. He's going to be a gardener. He's got to be really good at identifying plants, at pulling things, at bending over, all this kind of stuff. So that's where we're going to emphasize our brain enhancement and strength. We're going to myelinate or put these fatty sheaths on the neurons that are important for that process and other processes that are like it. We're going to make the connections between the parts of the brain that do this activity really, really fast. And we're going to let some other nerve tissue go because this guy's never thrown a baseball in his life. So it doesn't really matter if he throws a baseball. It doesn't really matter if he plays piano. He doesn't do much math. So we're not going to focus there. Now, it's not that you can't learn to do those things later in life. It's not that you can't learn to be exceptional at those things, but it's much harder. So what happens starting around 12 is that your brain starts to replace about 1% of its gray matter every year, or its nerve potential essentially, with 1% of myelinated superhighways or fast streams between parts of the brain. So that in the teen years and early adulthood, the brain starts to talk to itself much, much better. So you now have the ability for your parts of your brain to communicate better, which is great, but you're left with a little bit less brain flexibility. And 20 or 30 years later, now we're talking a significant change has taken place. So try to teach riding a bicycle to someone who's 20, who's never ridden a bike. Mm-hmm. It's very scary for them, and it's almost impossible. Try to take on a new language at 30 years of age, 40 years of age. To get that accent is so difficult. But if you learn a foreign language before 12, you'll speak like a native if you are immersed in it enough to develop the accent. Okay. So there are a number of things like this that essentially we know now about the brain that make learning things earlier easier. Again, it doesn't mean you can't do it later, but it's just easier.
So, we've looked at this specifically in terms of skill. And it's funny, I always wondered why it is that I managed to learn my native language without ever opening a book about it. We spent 6 weeks in India. We left and I was fluent. And to this day, I can't dissect that process for you.
Yeah, you just had it. It was around you enough. Your brain was open enough to it. You weren't even conscious about it. You just figured it out. But if you were to go back to, or to another country now, let's say you go to China now, and you're there trying to learn Chinese, it would be easier for you than many other people simply because you know a second language already, and so those tracks in your brain are more enhanced, and so it'll be easier. But still, learning Chinese would be a whole lot harder than it was to learn your native Indian language once upon a time.
Mm-hmm. So, we've looked at this specifically from the area of skill development. And I'm curious, can you make changes to, particular areas like self-esteem, sense of self-worth, like all of those things as you get older, or do those things get like cemented as well? Yes. Because, those things I feel like have such a profound impact on our relationship with other people.
Yeah, and that's an area of great emerging interest. And in my case, that interests me a great deal because I'm interested in why adolescents take risks and what happens when they do take risks and how people make decisions. And so we've been learning over the last 15 years or so, and in large part because of schools that have invested in this sort of thing and some of the brain research we have, that young people, at least, can enhance some of these resilience type factors like self-esteem or self-efficacy, the ability to actually accomplish what you set out to accomplish, believe you're capable of it, have a more internalized sense of control or locus of control. Things like emotion regulation, like how do I handle the inevitable bumps in the road that life is going to send my way? How do I handle a breakup? How do I handle getting a bad grade in a class? How do I handle a friend telling me they don't want to go to the party with me? These things can be devastating for some. And of course, we've talked about puberty already and why they're so intense for young people. And most people, the pain of this dulls over time as they get to understand how the world works. But I think that there's also a lot we can do to train people for these bumps and to help them to manage these things. So A, they feel support. B, they're engaged in healthy practices that will help them absorb this. For example, getting enough sleep and getting enough exercise, and these kind of things can actually make a huge difference to the brain and how we tolerate insults. And then finally, actually teaching them very specific skills. And I think that honestly, we should be doing this in school really from a very young age. How do you identify emotions? How do you know when you're feeling nervous or sad or scared or angry? And how do you then work with your mood when you don't want to feel that way and keep a general sense of, if not total control, at least a sense of knowing how to modulate your emotions a little bit, which we can teach to young people.
You're ready to get back into yoga, so you ordered the essentials, a non-slip mat, yoga blocks to keep balance, and an exercise ball. And you used your Bank of America Cash Rewards credit card, choosing to earn 3% cash back on online shopping or up to 5.25% as a preferred rewards member, which you put towards the cost of your most essential yoga gear, noise-canceling headphones. Apply for yours at bankofamerica.com/more rewarding. Copyright 2020 Bank of America Corporation.
It's not just what you sell that moves the bottom line, it's also how you upgrade the customer experience. And in a crowded marketplace where customers can go wherever they wish with the tap of a button, you need every edge you can get. Introducing Citizens Pay. It's a buy now, pay later solution that lets your shoppers get the upgrades they want right away by paying for them in smaller pieces over time. I recently used Citizens Pay to get a new top-of-the-line ergonomically designed home office chair, and I do my research, and I loved the fact that I didn't have to settle for less than the best reviewed chair on the market. I could still fit it into my monthly budget by spreading out the cost over a number of months. And when customers like me get the things they want, so does your business. More purchasing power with your business today means more customer loyalty in the long run. So while your customers enjoy their new 64-inch zillion-pixel TVs, state-of-the-art exercise equipment, and 6-burner stoves to fry, saute, and steam with perfection, you'll be enjoying a nice little boost to your bottom line. Citizens Pay. Get the power to upgrade how you do business. So a couple of nights ago, I couldn't really sleep, and when I woke up in the morning, I was struggling to put together a coherent sentence, which is really annoying considering that writing is the first thing that I do every morning, and I just felt off. Maybe you've had a night like that too, where the whole day kind of falls apart. Well, I loaded up Newcom on my phone, put on some headphones and their eye mask. 20 minutes later, I felt like I'd compensated for not getting enough sleep and somehow got this amazing power nap. Of course, it's not a substitute for getting enough sleep, but stress, sleep, recovery, whether in the gym or at work, these things really shape how we perform. And they're things you've heard every one of our podcast guests talk about. But for those days when you do wake up in a bit of a funk, Newcom can be a game changer. Newcom is the only stress management system of its kind that's clinically proven in over 1 million sessions to improve your sleep. Reduce your stress, boost your recovery without drugs or side effects. The Newcom system uses cutting-edge neuroscience and consists of 3 non-invasive and non-pharmaceutical items, all of which are included in your monthly subscription, which costs less than a daily cup of coffee. And the whole process is super easy to use and to work into your daily routine to achieve better sleep reduction and stress and boost recovery. So, when you wake up in a bit of a funk, own the day with Newcom. We have a special link set up just for our listeners. Go to creativenewcom.com and get 50% off your 30-day subscription of Newcom and their money-back guarantee. Again, that's Creative Newcom, creative, Nucalm.com. Throughout the 1990s, Coca-Cola grew into a multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporation, and they were beloved by many, especially Americans, which is why when they changed their recipe to what they called New Coke in 1985, the backlash was swift and severe, and the man who drove it, Roberto Goizueta, pulled New Coke from shelves in a matter of months. Wondery's Business Movers explores how the reformulated New Coke disrupted Coca-Cola's public perception. The story of New Coke is often seen as a classic case study for how not to launch a product and a cautionary tale of an out-of-touch executive who defied conventional wisdom and played a dangerous game with his company's signature product. But that's not the whole story. The real story of New Coke is far more complex and far more human. The story of Roberto Goizueta's improbable rise and his controversial decision to change the recipe for Coke starts decades before the launch of New Coke in the midst of a violent political revolution in Havana, Cuba. If you grew up in the 80s like I did, you might remember this thing called the Pepsi Challenge. And this podcast is an amazing story about Coke, New Coke, and that secret formula that apparently was kept in a bank vault under lock and key. Listen to the newest season of Business Movers on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or listen ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app. Wondery. Feel the story. So that begs a lot of other questions. I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of, sort of social interaction when we're young, right? So interacting with the opposite sex seems like it's kind of a critical life skill. And you wonder, why isn't it taught in school? Are we not of the right age to really understand and appreciate it, or to really process it? And also, what is the impact of our social relationships and our parental relationships when we're younger on how our relationships play out as adults?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The idea of how is it that our early relationships influence how we end up behaving. Now, being raised by an attentive caregiver, whoever that is, a parent, a surrogate, it's all good. So you don't have to be raised by both your biological parents, and you don't have to, you can be raised by a single parent, and you can spend a lot of your time the first few years of life at a daycare center where neither of your parents are present for much of the day. As long as you have attentive, engaged caregivers who show you affection and support and take care of your basic needs and are responsive to you. And as you hopefully are raised in that kind of environment, then as you develop, you will start to model the relationships that were laid onto you. Now, there's some individual variation, of course, amongst people. Some people are better at, picking up on social cues, and some people are more responsive in one way or another. But in general, our parents have a huge amount to do with how it is that we learn to socialize and engage. Prior to puberty, when our kids aren't in school, they spend the vast majority of their time with their parents or other adults. Post-puberty, when our kids aren't in school, they spend less than 10% of their time with their parents. I mean, I have a 16-year-old, almost 17-year-old son. He's a junior in high school, and I love being with him, and he loves being with me, but I see him at dinner, and then we're around each other at night when there's homework, and sometimes I help, and I often lie with him in his bed at night before he goes to sleep or whatever and chat with him for a bit. But in terms of real amount of time, I mean, maybe we're around each other a few hours a day, but we're engaging directly, probably about an hour a day. And that's not an awful lot when you consider that when he was 8, his mother or I were engaging with him, 7 hours a day. Mm-hmm. So they learn a lot more from their peers as they age, and they're much more influenced by their peers. And it's easy for parents to sort of check out of this and to stop talking to their kids about certain things, or just, they'll let me know if there's a problem. But I really want to encourage parents, as I do in my work, to stay engaged and to talk to their kids about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and to talk to their kids about all these different things that they're concerned about, because our kids will get that information one way or another. And if they don't get it from us, they'll get it from peers or the computer, and often it will be misinformation. And so there's still a huge parenting job for us to do as our kids age, and they will model those relationships and take them into their life.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions is, why is it that we don't teach this in our schools? Do you think we're not, our kids not ready for it at that age?
No, I think the kids are ready. I think what's happened is, we've had a long-standing difficulty talking about emotions as a culture, A, and B, we've had difficulty finding science that supports the human relation training, essentially, or the character education training. But now we have some good data. Now we know that there are 3 things you can do that will actually make the quality of your brain's connections better. Exercise, aerobic exercise, mindfulness meditation, or meditation where you're quietly breathing, and yoga. Those 3 things, we know now clearly after 2 months, you have stronger brain connections from your frontal cortex to your emotional limbic brain, which means you can manage emotions better. We know that sleep also contributes to that process, and you see brain changes with that as well. So these are 4 things that we know we can be doing. If we do nothing else, we can do those things in school. But only a minority of kids get good exercise. The Center for Disease Control says we should start high school no earlier than 8:30, but only 20% of schools in the country adhere to that number. And in fact, if you ask me, and I do a lot of work in sleep, we should probably not start high school before 10 in the morning, because our kids are on a delayed sleep cycle. That's how they're built. And they're on that because of evolution too, because we needed the strongest, the toughest, those with the best immune response, the greatest speed, the greatest tolerance for pain and temperature extremes to be guarding the cave or guarding the treehouse at night. We needed those guys when our vision is bad and at night and we don't see very well. We need the strongest among us to protect our cave. And so they're geared to go to bed during those adolescent years at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning. And that's when the oldest people get up, when it's light out, when it's more safe. And then they guard the cave, and the adolescents then sleep till noon. This is what we see our kids doing automatically anyway. We built a society that works entirely against that. And so I think there's a lot we can do. We're just starting to see some movement in this direction. And I think we'll continue to see more in the decades to come.
So, I want to talk briefly about mental illness or cognitive dysfunctions like depression, ADHD, and all of that kind of stuff, because I know you referenced quite a bit of it in the book. As somebody who's dealt with both, and in many cases, mine have been circumstantial. Like, you get a bad grade or something doesn't go right in your life, and suddenly it kind of sends you into a tailspin. What does your work show, with kids about all of this and adolescents about all of this? And of course, how do we deal with it more effectively as we evolve into adulthood?
Yeah. So again, the idea that mental illness is not based upon necessarily how your parents raised you, although that can certainly contribute, and more upon how we learn to think about things and how we behave in this world. It really started to take hold in the 60s, and over the next 3 decades or so, we developed a number of good therapies, cognitive behavior therapies, of which there are many different types, but they all generally tend to work for the treatment of anxiety and depression, many for insomnia, many for trauma, post-traumatic stress. So these treatments are very effective. And again, I think we can teach these preventatively to kids, but that's very new to be doing that. We've known since the 80s and 90s that these treatments work for adults in these various things I've been talking about, anxiety and depression and so forth. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, we studied these things in adolescence. Some of these same treatments, but not all, work with prepubertal children. It's harder for them to grab onto the cognitive or the thinking sort of analysis of their thoughts and the cognitive distortions, as we call them, or the negative thoughts. But adolescents can certainly do it. And so we've shown that in many studies now for depression and anxiety, and we continue to teach that to kids. And again, as I said earlier, my big push is to try to teach this preventatively, so at least people are aware of it. They know that it exists. They know if they have a problem, it's a legitimate place to go for help. And they can hopefully learn to manage a lot of their negative thoughts as they age and go through life, so that they don't necessarily need to get to the point where they need a therapist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think I was 37 years old when I entered a therapist office for the first time, and after 2 weeks, I was like, "What the hell took me so long to do this? I should have done this 20 years ago."
Yeah, I think that's the experience for a lot of people, and the reason you didn't is because you're high functioning and you were doing fine. Maybe you weren't optimized, but you were doing well. You probably had relationships, you had jobs, you were making a living. So when you felt stressed, you're like, "Okay, I'm feeling stressed," but everybody feels stressed, or maybe it's just me. I don't know, but I'll keep going. And you were lucky not to have had a major depressive episode or a major anxiety problem or something else, or a drug problem. But some people do, and those people get help, but they're often do. But it's often on the later side. It's not that we can't help them, but now we're trying to do damage control. Whereas I think there's a lot we can do preventatively. And just like you said, think about this. We spend statistically about 30 to 35% of our life asleep. You're how old now?
39.
Have you ever taken a class, either in school anywhere, that taught you anything about sleep?
No, I just read Arianna Huffington's book.
Yeah, that's it. And you read that as an adult.
Yeah.
But no one ever taught you anything growing up in your education about how you spend a third of your life.
Yeah.
That's incredible to me. And what about what we do all day long? We think, our brains are busy, we're in relationships with people. They spent 12 years growing up teaching you about math. Uh-huh. You took more in college, perhaps, or some sort of quantitative requirement. They spent a couple of years teaching you about science. They spent 12 years teaching you English, but they never thought to teach you anything about sleep or anything about relationships other than what Shakespeare said or other people. Mm-hmm. All of those things are valuable, but the character education, if you like, the resilience enhancement I'm talking about, how we live, how we function, how we handle stress, I think it's vital for people to understand this, because so much of my job as a psychiatrist, once people get sick, is really just teaching them this stuff. A lot of it's what we call psychoeducation. It's like teaching them about their brain, because they don't understand why they're feeling so bad, and there's typically a reason.
Mm-hmm. So what is the impact of technology and social media and all the things that kind of are in our world today that, weren't when you and I were in college or adolescence? And how is this impacting the experience of adolescents, and how is it impacting the experience of parents?
Yeah, this is a big deal. There's no question that social media has changed a lot of things in our life, and it doesn't look like it's going away. So I think we have to learn how to deal with it. Again, as a father of 2 teens, later teens, but teens nonetheless, we've had to deal with this, and it hasn't been easy, and we've had to sort of learn as we go. Major medical organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and other groups are recommending that, we don't give our kids devices for years if we can help it, because we know that it's distracting, that it takes their mind off of certain things. Yes, it's fun, but, life isn't all about having fun. Life is about learning how to manage yourself in this world and feel like you're productive, and that will help make you happy. Playing more solitaire or, Call of Duty doesn't necessarily make you any happier beyond the moment that you're doing it, or a distraction. Mm-hmm. What we know about social media, well, let me tell you something about the brain first that we know, and why, in the case of adolescents at least, social media can be pretty damaging. In the last 10 years, we've learned that the brain's social attachment system, that is how we connect to other people, rides on top of the brain's physical pain system. So if you ask people, for example, and I do this when I give talks on this topic, I'll say, what's the most painful experience in your life? What do you imagine most people say?
A breakup?
Yeah, a breakup, a death of a parent, a death of a pet, a death of a grandparent, not getting into my first college choice that I thought I was going to get into and having to go to my third choice, whatever it was.
Sure.
I had to drop out of school because I didn't do well enough and then having to regroup. But it's almost never when I broke my arm when I was 7 or when I got into a car accident when I was 20. Now, if there was a severe and protracted illness, that may come up, or if there was a major injury in which someone was in a body cast for months, that may come up.
Yeah.
But by and large, people talk about the emotional upsets, and it's fascinating because we use the same words for physical as well as emotional pain. What hurts you? What's the most painful experience you've ever had? And so it's very clear to us that as we've now been able to study the brain through all sorts of different experiments, that actually the emotional pain is in the same neural tracks. If this is so real that you can actually give people who are feeling emotional pain medicines like Motrin and Tylenol, and they will feel emotionally better. They will feel less pain. So in the short run, when you feel hurt over a breakup, taking a gram of Tylenol or 600 Motrin may not be such a terrible idea, because at least for those few hours, it's going to dull that pain a little bit. It does actually make us feel less bad. And the reality is that when you think about how adolescents engage with each other through social media, they now have an opportunity to feel excluded all day long. So you can see that you weren't tagged in a Facebook photo. You can see that your friends were invited to a party, but you weren't. You can see using the Snap Map on Snapchat where all your friends are gathering and somehow you don't know about that gathering. And maybe you even asked one of them if they were free tonight and they said no, but then you see all of them hanging out at somebody's house because you can see this on your phone.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of opportunity for kids to feel left out. And when kids feel left out, they feel pain. And this is why to a mother or father of a 13-year-old or a 17-year-old, you're like, why are you so upset? So you didn't get invited to the party. Like, whatever, just get over it. But it feels like physical pain. And it's so important that we feel that pain so that, again, back to our evolutionary argument, we will do everything possible to get with our peers so that we can mate and be successful. So it's life or death for them. It's not just like I wasn't invited to the party. It's like I wasn't invited to the party and therefore my genes will not live on. And so it's become very, very important to us that we have that sort of connection to our peers. And you have to ask yourself then, what would an adolescent do if they were left out? And what would they do to not feel left out? Well, they'd take a risk. If somebody else is jumping off that bridge into the river, then they'll probably do it because being left out is too painful. If they're racing cars, then they'll probably do it. If they're drinking the 10th beer in that hour, they'll probably do it because they don't want to feel left out. So social media has only allowed our kids to feel more left out and therefore, I think, to engage in more risk. And I think then it's incumbent upon parents and really, honestly, some of the companies that are making these devices to be more thoughtful about how we give them to kids. I don't know if it's true or not, but everybody always said Steve Jobs said he'd never give his kids an iPhone. And if it's true, then he understood something about this. He understood how damaging this constant contact is.
It's interesting because, I had an experience even as an adult where I was in a pseudo long distance relationship and it was 24/7 just chatting on Facebook. And when it ended, I don't think it was the person's physical contact because I didn't see them very much in person. My business partner, Brian, said he's like, that was like cutting a rat off a cocaine supply. He said, he's like, that's what would explain the tailspin. He's like, if you're constantly getting this dopamine surge all day long and then suddenly it's gone, it's not surprising that it sends you into a depression.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And it's this idea that you stopped having this thing to look forward to, stopped having this connection. And again, you were an adult. So imagine being a kid and having this constant give and take. My kids have said to me numerous times, I kind of wish I grew up in a world without cell phones. I hear patients tell me that too. Teenagers tell me that sometimes, like, oh, this thing is such a pain in the ass. And they don't know how to live without it because they never had to. So I think giving our kids some real breaks, like we call these like digital holidays or digital fasts, where we basically say, okay, for 24 hours, or we're going away this weekend, we're not bringing phones. Mm-hmm. My wife and I would take a lot of vacations with our kids when they were younger, and we would go away, 3 or 4 times a year, even for a weekend or for a week. And sometimes we'd drive, sometimes we'd fly, but we would never let them take any digital device with them. And it just forced them to be with us. It forced them to be in the moment. We had a harder time with it because we had work obligations ourselves. And so we had to be very mindful of not being on our devices too, because that's not the message you want to send.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that, we were talking about before, we hit record here is the fact that, you went to Berkeley and it sounds like we had similar experiences. I didn't even attempt the pre-med thing. Like I got there and I was like, yeah, there's no way. And even then I got really shitty grades. But one thing that really struck me was, this moment in your life when you were discouraged from, a career in medicine. And, here you are, like a psychiatrist who's written a book, like you've clearly had a successful career in medicine. One, how did you deal with and process that moment? And, how do parents deal with this in their own kids when they see that, okay, this is not going to lead you somewhere? So I can tell you that there's a couple other questions that come from this. I think, it's funny. My parents will deny this to the day that they die about encouraging me to become a doctor. But pretty much my entire life, I was told, yeah, if you want a good life, become a doctor. And I think as a result, I decided not to become a doctor. So how do the two questions in one, I realized, like, where do parents draw the line between sort of, encouraging their kids or doing what your parents did to put you back on track and not stifling them? And then how did you, process this entire sort of ability to bounce back when somebody tells you you're not going to have a career in medicine, and yet here you are today? Yeah.
So, what you're referring to is, my second year of college, I got a D in organic chemistry, and there's no way you're getting into medical school with a D. You can't really go on in a series of organic chemistry with a D. So I couldn't take part 2 of the class. So I had to decide what to do, and I went to see my advisor, who was a very nice guy, Peter, and Peter said, listen, you're not going to get into medical school. So what else interests you? What other kind of things do you like to do? And how else would you want to spend your career? And you're doing well in history classes and, whatever else. And that was discouraging to hear, but not surprising. But it wasn't the first time I'd been discouraged. I think early on, that experience of doing poorly in high school that we talked about earlier, my first year of high school was an experience where I knew I could come back. I think going to Berkeley, which, only a few kids from my high school went to. We were 2,000 in my high school, 500 graduating, and I think maybe, half a dozen at most went to Berkeley and UCLA combined. It wasn't many. And there were a few who went to private schools here and there, but mostly kids went to the local community college or didn't go to college. Some went to state schools. And the idea that I could get through all of that and become a Berkeley student, I don't know, there was something inside of me that just, it made me anxious at the time, I remember, and I felt terrible. I don't think I got depressed. At least I wouldn't have known at the time if I were, but I know that I felt like angry and frustrated, and I hated the teacher, but other kids had gotten A's, so what was wrong with me? And I decided to go back at it, and I went back the next year, and I got a B+, and the next time I took it, it wasn't great, but I got an A the next semester in organic chemistry too. And I just kept pushing through those classes thinking, well, I don't know if I want to be a doctor or not, but I want to at least have the option, so I'm going to finish these pre-med requirements that you need to have. And I did major in history because I really liked history, and I got a lot of empowerment there. I was an A student in history, and I learned to write better, and I learned to express my ideas better. And, I was one of those kids who was always nice and always did well when I got in front of a group, but I would worry about getting in front of a group, and I would get sweaty and shaky when I raised my hand in class, until I felt really comfortable there. And I didn't want to feel that way. I wanted to be braver, and I wanted to be more outgoing. And so putting myself in history actually really demanded that. I had to put my ideas on paper more. I had to stand up in front of the class and give presentations and ask questions. And I became really a man on campus. I was on the Chancellor's Committee on Student Conduct. I was one of the counselors, then coordinators of CALSO, the Cal Student Orientation Program at Berkeley. I'm a member of the Order of the Golden Bear, this honor society at Berkeley. I really turned into a guy on campus who knew a lot of people, and I was dating the vice president of the school back then. And I don't know, it became a great playground for me. And I think a lot of times these stumbling blocks are huge opportunities for us. I think we hear this all the time, but I know in my life it's true. If you don't have a challenge that's meaningful, that it's worth working for, then I think, what are you here for? I think there's a lot that gets us motivated. And for me, it was, this Texan who was a terrible teacher in organic chemistry, who whistled when he spoke, like the guy on Family Guy. And I was like, okay, I'm going to master this class. Like, I am just going to fight this down. And I took it again and did well. And I think that there's a real a lesson there for all of us.
Wow. So I want to finish by talking specifically about this area of risk, which is really what your work in this book has been about. And I have some interesting sort of takes on risk, because it's funny. So I guess the easiest way to preface this is with a couple of stories. So, my sister, by the time she got to Berkeley, she was kind of like, had done all that, partied while she was in high school, went to parties where she drank and did drugs. And as a result, by the time she got to Berkeley, it wasn't all that interesting to her. And she was a really good student. Especially growing up in an immigrant family, if you're the first kid, you're always the experiment. Like, my parents, didn't understand that, in seventh grade, it's important to be popular and have nice clothes. When they got that, with my sister, they're like, oh, we've been through this before, so we don't, basically I was the experiment, and they got to fix all those mistakes on my sister. And so what's interesting to me is, we're talking about risk, and part of me wonders is, like, where is that line of risk, in terms of, okay, because I think, much of my behavior that was risky, I engaged in because I wasn't exposed to it earlier on.
Yeah, I think that hard to know. I don't think, honestly, what we know from looking at statistics, at least, is that we're better off holding off on engaging in risk for as long as possible. Mm-hmm. Now, like your sister, I really engaged in most of my risky behavior in junior high school and early high school. I tried cocaine when I was in 8th grade. I got drunk for the first time in 6th grade. I was stealing cigarettes from the grocery store when I was 8 years old. And I grew up in a sort of a youngest of 5 kids. It was a loving, but a very sort of free range childhood. People were kind of doing their own thing, and no one really knew where everyone was. And it wasn't until my parents had that history of buildup of seeing what happens to kids when they don't get a lot of, supervision, and I started to do poorly in school, that's when they really sat on me. But I look back, not long ago, my parents moved. They're in their 90s now. And I was going back in my report cards. And in 5th grade, I got a D in math in 5th grade. That was my grade for the semester. So, like, what the hell were they doing then? That would have been a great time to intervene. It might have made a difference. Mm-hmm. They waited until the grades really mattered, or until they had the time and could pay attention and really notice what was going on. But I was a bright kid. There's no reason I should be getting a D in math. I didn't care. So I think that I engaged in risk early. Then by the time I started to get some self-efficacy, some good feeling out of doing well in school, by that time, when my friends were now drinking in 10th grade, 11th grade, and like, let's get drunk on the weekend, I'm like, I'd done that before. I did that in 6th grade. I did that in 7th grade. I don't need to do that anymore. Mm-hmm. So for me, I was getting more fulfillment, not out of drinking, but out of doing well in my classes and knowing that I was going to be a doctor at that time, or that I was going to go on and have a good career. And I really was lucky. And I did see people, again, in college who'd never done that stuff in high school, and they got sort of unleashed in college and kind of went a little berserk then. Mm-hmm. I think there's a difference in how we raise our kids. I think that if you raise your kid like, you could never do this and you got to be afraid of it, and I'm going to punish you severely if you do this, then you have kids who often go off to college and they're like, all right, let it roll, baby, dying to get out there and do it. But I think that for those kids whose parents talk with them about this stuff, they're not authoritarian, but they're authoritative. They say, listen, I understand a lot of kids do these things, and we understand this happens. I want to tell you this isn't good for you. I want to tell you that if you go out and get drunk, I don't want you driving home. I will always come pick you up, and we'll have a talk about it the next morning. But, and there may be a consequence, but I would much rather know than not know, and we're going to work this out together. Mm-hmm. And I would like you to wait as long as possible, because right now, if you drink at 13 or 15 or 17, you do much more damage to your brain and your future than you do if you drink at 25. And we know that if you don't drink by the time you're 25, or if you don't smoke marijuana by the time you're 25, there's a really, really small chance that you'll ever pick it up. So the longer we hold off people, the longer their brains have a chance to develop in the way that is good for them. And it gives them more choices and more flexibility as adults. And that's, another thing we're not teaching in school is neuroscience in general. Uh-huh. And we don't teach anything about the brain. I learned nothing about the brain growing up. So again, we know a lot more about this organ. There's a lot more we can teach kids. And that kind of messaging, I think, is valuable. There's a lot of other things, which I talk about in the book, that focus on helping our kids to manage and think about how to moderate the risk of drinking and smoking and, unprotected sex and all of that. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's as simple as if they don't do it in high school, they'll go crazy in college, or if they do it in high school, they won't do it in college. I think it's more likely if they do it in high school, they'll do it in college. So what you want to do is you kind of want to – your sister and I were somewhat exceptional, but I think because we had – probably found what fulfilled us early on. It's not like I didn't get drunk in college or as an adult, or I didn't smoke weed in college, but nothing like when I was younger.
Yeah, well, that's funny. Didn't smoke weed in college. My I finally came clean with my parents about 3 weeks ago. They're like, have you smoked weed? I'm like, I went to Berkeley. What do you guys think? They were like, do you still? I was like, yeah, I have a prescription. It was kind of amusing to see. And it was funny. They're like, we're not idiots. We know that you smoke. Like, yeah. But it was, just to not have had that conversation with my parents in all these years was really interesting, which I think kind of makes me want to close with sort of a final question around drugs in particular. Like I know that there's been research and stuff around sort of the effectiveness of microdosing psychedelics. We're seeing, legalization happening of marijuana everywhere, across multiple states. So how does that play into all of this as far as your view goes? Because I don't imagine I'm going to stop smoking marijuana anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when it comes to young people, there's a lot of reasons we're legalizing marijuana, which have nothing to do with knowing how good or bad it is for us. We don't, the jury is really out on lots of aspects of marijuana, particularly how it affects us in the long run, how bad it is for our lungs, how bad or good it is for our brains, how bad or good it is for our kidneys and livers. That we haven't really been studying this drug in the same way, but it is a drug. And like everything we put in our body, it has an effect. And some drugs or foods have psychoactive effects, and this is one of them. So understanding now that it's becoming legalized and we're able to do studies on it, then we're going to learn more in the next decade. And, you may or may not decide that you still want to smoke it in 10 years if you're still using it then, because you may know more. We have a lot of concern about marijuana being a trigger or a precipitant of psychosis in young people. And there's been gathering data on that. There's a little bit of data to oppose it, but there's a fair amount of data to suggest that it's a real thing. And particularly kids who are pre-psychotic or kids who are pre-depressive and they have the risk of becoming manic or depressed or psychotic, then giving them marijuana and having it readily available may not only trigger their episodes sooner, which is not good for them, but also make it harder to recover from and potentially worse. So these are things we need to learn about. For most typical people, we don't really know what marijuana does to them other than get them high or relieve a little bit of pain or anxiety or help them sleep or whatever else. So we're going to be learning a lot. And I think the states are doing this largely because they need the money. Like we rolled out lotteries again many years ago because we needed the money, not because everybody thinks we should be gambling, but we need the money. And marijuana is it's a great product to tax. Yeah. So all these states like California, after January, when it goes legal, they're going to balance their budget for the first time in, decades. And that's going to be incredible for them because they need the income. But, I think on the other hand, when we make it legal, we tell our kids that, well, when you're 18 or 21, it's okay. Sure. Which really, when we say that, then we sort of mean that, you can experiment when you're 13 or 15. And I think that there's a risk with that. Honestly, I don't know what the risk is, but I think, again, the message to parents is really you're better off holding off all use as long as possible, no matter what you do specifically. And your kids, you can tell your kids, you don't have to tell your kids, they don't need to know. I mean, if you have kids and your kids, when they're 8, say, Daddy, do you smoke marijuana? You can be truthful and tell them. You can also not tell them. And you can say, that's something we'll talk about when you're older, or I don't want to talk about that right now. You're the parent and you still run the show. And it's about being consistent and straight with your kids so that they know what to expect as opposed to giving them everything they want whenever they want it.
Wow. Well, this has been truly fascinating. You've packed it with so much valuable insight and information. So I'm going to finish with my final question, which is how we finish all of our interviews, the unmistakable creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Unmistakable. Well, I suppose it's what do we mean by unmistakable? I sort of think of unmistakable as it's not by accident or unique in some way or in some format who they are. I'm a psychiatrist, so I get very biological around these kinds of things. I think it's some combination of genetic predisposition and exposures that people have as they age in terms of who makes them what they are. I think we have a lot of choice in this matter up to a point. But I think that if we grow up in an environment of great neighborhood disorganization and violence and crime and theft, then we have very few choices. And as we age, we don't have the brain flexibility to imagine how else life could be. And so when someone gets us upset, we may respond in a very dogmatic way, violently, passively, whatever we do, but not see a lot of flexibility. So, in my life, the things that have been meaningful to me have been having enough opportunity and enough competition and competitive drive to pursue it. And I think that not all kids have that opportunity, but to give people a little bit of a stumbling block as well as opportunity to overcome it. In the way we've been talking about resilience, I think I guess I'm thinking as I go here, but I would say that the opportunity to establish and enhance your own resilience, your own belief in yourself, is probably the thing that matters the most in terms of our uniqueness.
Wow. Amazing. Where can people learn more about you, your work, and the book?
Yeah, sure. The book is called Born to be Wild, Why Teens Take Risks and How We Can Help Keep Them Safe. Teens was the word the publisher wanted. I wanted adolescent because we really think about adolescence as being about 12, 13 to about 25, 26. And that is the zone that the book covers. It's filled with stories. Yes, there's science and lots of references, but it's all in the back. And when you read the book, it reads like a story, but there is a lot of learning. And I learned a lot by writing it. So it's Born to be Wild. I'm Jess Shatkin, Shatkin. I have a website, drjesspshatkin.com. There's lots of information there about the things I do, the talks I give, the writing and patient care I provide, and the books everywhere, bookstores, Amazon, etc.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
You're ready to get back into yoga, so you ordered the essentials, a non-slip mat, yoga blocks to keep balance, and an exercise ball. And you used your Bank of America Cash Rewards credit card, choosing to earn 3% cash back on online shopping, or up to 5.25% as a preferred rewards member, which you put towards the cost of your most essential yoga gear, noise-canceling headphones. Apply for yours at bankofamerica.com/more rewarding. Copyright 2020 Bank of America Corporation.